The world before. Geography of an unrecognizable planet. Imagine standing on a coastline that no longer exists. The water laps at your feet. The sky stretches wide and clear. And behind you cities, not ruins, not fragments. Cities living, breathing, full of people who wake up every morning, trade goods, speak languages we have never heard, and look up at the same stars we do tonight. They have no idea what is coming. And neither, for most of human history, did we. The Earth 5,000 to 12,000 years ago was not the Earth we know. The geography itself was different, not metaphorically, but physically. Sea levels were dramatically lower during and just after the last ice age. In some regions, the ocean stood more than 120 meters below where it stands today. That means land now buried under the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the South China Sea was once dry ground, walkable, habitable, and almost certainly inhabited. What we call the Bering Land Bridge, the corridor connecting Asia to North America, was not a narrow strip of land. It was a vast territory, known to scientists as Beringia, likely stretching over 1,500 kilometers wide. People did not simply cross it. They may have lived there for generations, building communities we have no record of because the sea eventually swallowed everything. The same is true for Doggerland, the sunken landmass connecting Britain to continental Europe, now lying silently beneath the North Sea. The climate was different, too. The Sahara, today one of the most hostile places on Earth, was green, lush. Rivers flowed through it. Hippos bathed in lakes where only sand dunes stand now. Rock paintings discovered in the central Sahara depict giraffes, crocodiles, and cattle, animals that could never survive there today. The data is not speculative. It is painted on stone, confirmed by satellite imaging, backed by pollen samples pulled from sediment cores. The world before the flood was a different world, not slightly different. Fundamentally, almost unrecognizably different. Perhaps the most haunting implication is what all of this means for human history. If coastal civilizations existed during the Ice Age and in the millennia immediately following it, they would have built their cities near water, as all civilizations do. And when the seas rose, slowly at first, and then catastrophically, those cities went under. We have been searching for the origins of civilization in the desert and in the highlands, because that is where archaeology can find things. But the oldest human settlements may be sitting on the ocean floor, perfectly preserved in silt, waiting for the technology that will finally reach them. This is not where the story ends. It is where it begins. Because if the world before the flood was unrecognizable geographically, the question that follows is even more unsettling. Who was living in it? The great civilizations that came before every history book starts the same way. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. The story of civilization, we are told, begins around 3000 to 3500 BCE. Cities appear, writing appears, governments appear, and the assumption, the one rarely questioned, is that before this moment, human beings were wandering in the dark, hunting, gathering, surviving, but not yet thinking at the scale required to build something lasting. That assumption is crumbling. The Sumerian civilization did not announce itself as something new. It arrived already knowing things. The first Sumerian cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, appear in the archaeological record with a sophistication that suggests a long, invisible development. Irrigation systems, grain storage, astronomical calendars, legal codes, written language. These are not the inventions of a culture in its infancy. They are the expressions of a culture that has already gone through centuries, possibly millennia, of intellectual refinement. Where did that refinement happen? The Sumerians themselves had an answer. Before the flood, the Sumerian king list, one of the most extraordinary documents in human history. begins its account with kings who reigned before a great deluge. The list names them, gives their cities, and assigns them reign lengths that stretch into the tens of thousands of years. Scholars largely dismiss these numbers as mythological, but the structure of the document is not mythological. It is administrative. It reads like a bureaucratic record, and embedded within it is an insistence, repeated, deliberate, that there was organized governance before the waters came. Egypt tells a similar story from a different direction. The earliest dynastic Egypt already shows signs of a fully formed priestly class, a cosmological framework of staggering complexity, and an architectural ambition that did not develop over generations but seemed to appear fully realized. The Sphinx, according to geologist Robert Schoch's analysis of its erosion patterns, may have been carved not in 2500 BCE, but thousands of years earlier, during a period of heavy rainfall that no longer existed in historical Egypt. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx predates everything we thought we knew about Egyptian civilization. And then there are the legends. Every ancient culture carries within it a memory of something older, something greater. The Egyptians spoke of Zeb-Tepi the first time, a golden age before the current world. The Sumerians described the Apkallu, the seven sages, as fishmen who rose from the sea and brought civilization to humanity. The Greeks remembered Atlantis. The Vedic texts of India describe a civilization so advanced, so spiritually and technically refined, that it makes our current achievements look modest. These are not stories from isolated cultures. They are variations of the same memory, told around the world. And somewhere beneath all the metaphor, there is something real. Giants and the Nephilim, myth or something else. Open the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 4, and you will find one of the most quietly disturbing passages in all of Scripture. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That's it. 2 sentences, no explanation, no apology. Just a statement, delivered as plain fact. The beings of extraordinary origin and extraordinary stature walked the earth before the flood. The Nephilim appear in multiple ancient traditions, under different names, but with strikingly similar descriptions. The Book of Enoch, a text considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and quoted directly in the New Testament, describes them in vivid detail. Beings of enormous height, born of celestial fathers and human mothers, who consumed the earth's resources, corrupted the land, and whose violence was one of the reasons the flood was sent. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki, those who from heaven came to earth, occupy an eerily parallel role. In Greek mythology, the Titans. In Norse tradition, the giants who came before the gods. What do we do with skeletal remains? Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, reports surfaced from across the United States, South America, Europe, and the Middle East, describing the discovery of human-like skeletons of unusual size, 7 feet, 8 feet, in some accounts larger. The Smithsonian Institution has been accused, through multiple historical sources, of receiving and subsequently losing such remains. Most mainstream archaeologists dismiss these accounts as hoaxes, misidentifications, or sensationalism. But the sheer volume of independent reports from different continents and different centuries makes the dismissal feel, at times, a little too convenient. Here is what is not in dispute. Ancient humans were not as physically diminutive as is sometimes assumed. Cro-Magnon specimens, the earliest anatomically modern humans, were frequently taller and more robustly built than modern people. But the reports surrounding the Nephilim tradition go considerably beyond normal human variation. They describe beings who towered over their contemporaries, who possessed strength disproportionate even to their size, and who lived at the intersection of the human and something not entirely human. The spiritual dimension of this cannot be ignored. In the theological framework of the antediluvian narrative, whether read through Hebrew, Sumerian, or Enochian texts, the Nephilim represent a contamination, an intrusion of something that should not have been. The flood, in this reading, is not a punishment for generic wickedness. It is a reset, a correction, a hard deletion of a world that had gone wrong at the most fundamental level of its biology. And if that sounds extreme, consider how many traditions around the world, independently, across thousands of miles, arrive at the same conclusion. The absurd longevity of the ancients. 969 years. That is how long the Bible says Methuselah lived. Adam, 930. Noah himself, 950. We read these numbers, and we either accept them literally, dismiss them as symbolic, or look for a clever middle ground. Perhaps a different calendar system was used. Perhaps years meant lunar months. But here is what almost nobody asks. What if those numbers, wildly improbable by our standards, are pointing at something real? The Sumerian king list does not help skeptics feel more comfortable. It records pre-flood kings with reign lengths that dwarf even Methuselah. Ululam of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Enmenluana, for 43,200. The total combined reign of the 8 pre-flood kings, 241,200 years. These are not typos. They appear consistently across multiple versions of the list, carved in different locations at different times. Whatever these numbers mean, they are intentional. And the cultural impulse to record them as history, not as myth, but as administrative history, demands some form of explanation. One avenue that serious researchers have begun exploring is the atmosphere itself. Today's atmosphere contains roughly 21% oxygen. Some paleontologists and geologists have proposed that pre-flood atmospheric composition may have been significantly different. Higher oxygen, higher pressure, a thicker water vapor canopy that filtered radiation more aggressively and created a kind of global greenhouse environment. Under such conditions, biological aging would function differently. Cellular repair mechanisms would be more efficient. The cascading damage we associate with aging might accumulate more slowly. This remains theoretical, but it is not incoherent. Genetics offers another angle. The field of epigenetics has demonstrated that environmental conditions, stress, diet, radiation exposure, oxygen levels can alter gene expression in ways that affect longevity significantly. Some researchers studying the blue zones, the regions of the modern world where people regularly live past 100, have found that the combination of diet, low stress, physical activity, and specific atmospheric conditions creates a biochemical environment that dramatically slows cellular aging. Scale that up. Imagine a worldwide blue zone. Imagine a pre-flood Earth with richer soil, cleaner water, different air, and the number 969 begins to seem less like fantasy and more like a data point from a lost world. The other possibility, the one that no peer-reviewed journal will touch, is intentional genetic modification. If the antediluvian traditions are taken seriously, and if the beings who preceded modern humanity were themselves the product of some form of hybridization or enhancement, then their biology may have operated on fundamentally different parameters. Not magic, not metaphor, different biology. The same way a tortoise lives 200 years and a mayfly lives a day, not because of different spiritual worth, but because of different biological architecture. What is certain is this: every ancient tradition, from the Bible to the king list to the Vedic epics, insists that the humans of the pre-flood world were not like us. They lived longer, often grew larger, and operated within a world so different from our own that the memory of it had to be encoded in myth just to survive transmission. Something changed when the waters came. And whatever changed, it changed permanently. Inexplicable technology and architecture. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza and try to hold the math in your mind. 2.3 million stone blocks. Average weight, 2.5 to 15 tons each. Positioned with tolerances so precise that a human hair cannot be inserted between them. The base is level 2 within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter span. An engineering precision that modern construction, with laser-guided equipment, struggles to replicate. Now ask yourself, how long did it take to build this? Current estimates say 20 years. That means that to meet the timeline, workers would have needed to set one block every 2 minutes, around the clock, for 2 decades. Without computers, without cranes, without steel, working only with copper chisels, wooden sledges, and human muscle. Something does not add up. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in southeastern Turkey in the 1990s, is perhaps the single most disruptive archaeological find of the 20th century. Dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, making it roughly 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, and 6,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. It consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with intricate animal carvings. The pillars weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried, transported, carved, and assembled by people who, according to the prevailing archaeological model of that era, were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, with no settled society, no surplus food, no organized labor force. And yet there it stands, deliberately buried. Moreover, the entire complex was intentionally covered under thousands of tons of earth, around 8,000 BCE, not destroyed, hidden. Why would you bury something you built? Unless you were trying to preserve it, unless you knew what was coming. The megalithic structures scattered across every continent, from the stone circles of Ireland, to the temple platforms of Peru, to the precision-cut blocks of Puma Punku in Bolivia, share a common impossibility. They were built with a degree of engineering accuracy that exceeds anything we can confidently attribute to the tools and methods their presumed builders possessed. The H-blocks of Puma Punku, carved from andesite and diorite, among the hardest stones on Earth, fit together with a precision that would challenge a modern CNC machine. No two blocks are alike, yet each fits its neighbor perfectly. No mortar was used. None was needed. The acoustic properties of ancient stone structures have become an emerging field of study. Researchers have found that Stonehenge, the Hal-Safliene hypogeum in Malta, and multiple other megalithic sites were apparently designed to produce specific acoustic resonances at specific frequencies. Frequencies that correspond, in some cases, to the theta and delta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, altered consciousness, and visionary experience. This is not coincidence. This is engineering. Whoever built these places understood physics that we are only now beginning to articulate. The flood destroyed most of it. That is the unbearable part. We are looking at the survivors of an architectural tradition, the remnants, the outliers, the things that happen to be made of stone, or buried in desert sands, or submerged in conditions that preserve them. What was built of wood is gone. What was built in coastal cities is underwater. What was built in clay has dissolved into clay again. We are archaeologists, picking through the rubble of a civilization whose crown jewels we will likely never find: agriculture, food, and the Garden of Eden. Before the flood, people ate differently. That simple sentence carries more weight than it first appears. The transition from a primarily gathered wild food diet to an agricultural one represents one of the most significant biological and social pivots in human history, and it did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a specific time, in specific places, and for reasons that conventional history has never fully explained. Agriculture appeared almost simultaneously in Mesopotamia, the Yangtze River Valley, the highlands of Peru, and the lowlands of central Mexico, at roughly the same post-flood period, as if it had been restarted, as if someone, somewhere, knew it needed to be restarted. The Garden of Eden is one of the most persistently misread symbols in human culture. Most people encounter it as a children's story, a paradise, a snake, an apple, expulsion. But the Hebrew text contains within it a description of geography that corresponds, with remarkable precision, to the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. The garden is not placed in heaven. It is placed on earth, and the tradition of a fertile, abundant, biologically rich homeland, a place where food grew without labor, where death was not yet the norm, where the relationship between humanity and the natural world was cooperative, rather than adversarial, appears not only in Genesis, but in the traditions of the Sumerians, the Zoroastrians, the Vedic Hindus, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. What if Eden is not a myth, but a memory? The biodiversity of the pre-flood world was almost certainly greater than what we have today. Species extinction is not a modern problem. It began in earnest roughly 12,000 years ago. At precisely the same period as the Great Cataclysms, paleontologists have catalogued the rapid disappearance of dozens of megafauna species at this time. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses. The debate over whether humans hunted them to extinction, or whether a catastrophic environmental event wiped them out, has not been fully resolved, but the timing is striking. Whatever ended the Pleistocene was violent, fast, and catastrophic. The plants lost were perhaps even more significant. Ancient agricultural texts from Mesopotamia and Egypt refer to plant varieties that modern botanists cannot identify, crops with yields, medicinal properties, and nutritional profiles that seem to exceed anything in the current botanical record. The Sumerians described specific plants associated with the Apkallu as sources of knowledge and longevity. The Book of Genesis speaks of the tree of life, not as a metaphor, but as a biological entity, whose fruit conferred the prevention of death. We dismiss this as allegory. But it is worth asking, why would every ancient tradition in the world remember a plant that gave eternal life, if no such plant had ever existed in any form? The shift to grain-based agriculture, which became the dominant food system after the flood, was nutritionally catastrophic in ways that are now well documented. The skeletal records at archaeological sites show a clear deterioration in human health at the moment. Agriculture was adopted: shorter stature, more dental cavities, more bone disease, shorter lifespans. We adopted farming not because it was better for us. We adopted it because it was the only option left in a world whose ecological abundance had been mostly destroyed. The garden was gone. We were learning to survive without it. The causes of the flood, science and the sacred. There is a moment in the scientific literature when things get very quiet and very serious. It occurs when researchers from different fields, geology, astronomy, archaeology, climatology, begin to converge, independently, on the same conclusion, that between roughly 13,000 and 4,000 BCE, the Earth experienced a series of catastrophic events that fundamentally altered its surface, wiped out dozens of species, and likely destroyed one or more advanced human civilizations. The convergence is not dramatic. It is published in academic journals with sober titles. But what it describes is apocalyptic. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, proposed in 2007 by a team of researchers and expanded significantly since, argues that approximately 12,800 years ago, a fragmenting comet or asteroid struck or exploded over multiple points on Earth, including the ice sheets of North America, triggering wildfires that burned across a continent, a dramatic climate reversal, massive flooding from the melting of ice sheets, and a subsequent 1,000-year cold period that destabilized virtually every ecosystem on Earth. The evidence: a thin layer of platinum, iridium, nanodiamonds, and magnetic spherules, materials associated with cosmic layers, at over 50 sites across 4 continents, all dating to the same moment. Sea level rise adds a different dimension. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose approximately 120 meters over a period of roughly 10,000 years. Most of this was gradual, but within that long rise, there were pulses, sudden, dramatic surges, where the ocean rose several meters in a matter of decades. Meltwater pulse 1A, approximately 14,500 years ago, saw sea levels rise as much as 20 meters in just 500 years. The coastlines of every continent were swallowed. Everything built near the ocean, which is where human civilization almost invariably builds, was lost. Then there is the Black Sea event. Around 5,600 BCE, in a scenario reconstructed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, the rising Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus land barrier and flooded what had been a freshwater lake with salt water. The inundation was catastrophic and fast. The Black Sea expanded by tens of thousands of square kilometers. Coastal communities were destroyed. Populations fled in all directions, carrying with them the memory of a great flood that consumed their world. Many researchers believe this specific event is the origin of the flood narratives that spread from the Near East into the Hebrew, Sumerian, and Greek traditions. The sacred texts do not describe a gentle rain. They describe fountains of the deep breaking open, windows of heaven pouring out, waters that rose above the highest mountains. The language is violent. It is the language of people trying to describe something that exceeded any frame of reference they had. Geological evidence shows that massive tsunamis, triggered by submarine landslides and impact events, were capable of creating waves hundreds of meters tall. In a world where human beings lived primarily in coastal lowlands, a wave of that magnitude would have been indistinguishable, experientially, from the end of the world, the flood in every culture on Earth. Here is a fact that stops most people cold when they hear it for the first time. There are over 200 independent flood traditions from cultures on every inhabited continent. Not variations of the same story spread through cultural contact. Independent traditions, developed in geographic and linguistic isolation from one another, all telling the same essential story. A great flood comes. Most of humanity is destroyed. A small number of survivors, typically warned in advance by a divine or supernatural figure, escape by boat, by mountain, or by some form of miraculous protection. The world is then rebuilt. The parallels between the biblical Noah and the Sumerian Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh are so precise. The divine warning, the boat, the dimensions, the birds sent to find land, the offering made after the waters recede, that most scholars accept. They are drawing from the same source event. The Gilgamesh account predates the biblical version by at least 1,000 years. This does not undermine the biblical text. It suggests that both are independently preserving the memory of something that actually happened. Go further. In the Hindu tradition, Manu, the first man, is warned by a fish, who grows larger and larger until Manu realizes it is the god Vishnu. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a ship. The flood comes. The ship is tethered to a great mountain, and Manu emerges as the progenitor of a restored human race. The Greek Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha, survive a flood sent by Zeus, land on Mount Parnassus, and repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them that become people. In Chinese mythology, Nuwa repairs the sky after a cataclysm and controls the floodwaters. In the traditions of the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Aztec, the Maya, the peoples of Polynesia, the Aboriginal Australians, flood, always flood. What is most striking is not just the event, but the emotional architecture of the stories. In virtually every tradition, the flood is preceded by a period of moral deterioration, divine warning, and human indifference. Most people do not listen. Most people are lost. A remnant survives not by luck, but by responsiveness, by obedience, by some quality of character or spirit that distinguishes them. The narrative is not merely geological. It is moral. Every culture on earth chose to remember the flood, not as a natural disaster, but as a reckoning. This raises a question that science alone cannot answer. Why? Why would geographically isolated peoples, separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by thousands of years of separate development, all encode their memory of a flood event with the same moral framework? The simplest explanation is that the people who survived, wherever they were, carried not only the trauma of what had happened, but an interpretation of why it had happened. And they built that interpretation into their founding stories, into their religions, into their children. The flood is the most universally remembered event in human history, not the invention of the wheel, not the discovery of fire. The flood. That is not an accident. The ark, engineering, logistics, and the possibility. Let's do the math. According to Genesis, Noah's ark was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Using the standard Egyptian cubit of roughly 18 inches, that gives us approximately 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, and 14 meters tall. For scale, that is roughly the length of a World War II-era aircraft carrier. It had 3 internal decks and a displacement tonnage that would place it comfortably among large modern cargo vessels. Engineers at the Korea Research Institute of Ships and Ocean Engineering modeled the biblical dimensions in 1992 and found that the proportions described in Genesis are remarkably close to optimal for a vessel designed to survive heavy sea conditions without propulsion, better, in fact, than a square cross-section, which is what many skeptics assume the text describes. The Sumerian version, found in the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, gives different dimensions. The Sumerian ark is described as perfectly cubic, each side equal, which, if taken literally, would create a vessel of approximately 60 meters per side. Some researchers have interpreted this differently, suggesting the Sumerian vessel may have been circular, a large coracle, a boat design still used in parts of Iraq today. In 2014, an ancient cuneiform tablet discovered in the British Museum provided an apparently detailed construction manual for exactly such a circular vessel, dating to around 1900 BCE. The tablet specified the exact quantities of palm fiber, bitumen, and wooden ribs required. The animal question is the one that generates the most skepticism, and fairly so. Could a single vessel contain breeding pairs of every species on Earth? No, probably not, as literally described. But here is an alternative, reading that the text itself may support. The Hebrew word translated as species men is not a modern taxonomic term. It refers to a broader classification. 2 representatives of the dog kind, one pair would encompass the genetic diversity from which wolves, foxes, domestic dogs, and dozens of other canids could later diverge. Under this understanding, the number of animals required drops dramatically to perhaps a few thousand pairs. A large vessel with 3 decks and careful rationing could plausibly have accommodated this. But what if the ark was not primarily about animals? What if it was primarily about information? Every ancient flood narrative, when examined closely, emphasizes not just the survival of biological life, but the survival of knowledge. The Sumerian Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, is specifically described as preserving the divine instructions, the cultural records, the seeds of civilization. In the Vedic flood account, Manu preserves the sacred texts, the Vedas themselves. In the Mesoamerican traditions, the flood survivors carry with them the calendar, the astronomy, and the sacred rituals. The Ark, in this reading, is less a zoo and more a library, a capsule, a deliberate act of civilization preservation by people who understood what they were about to lose. Where is it now? Generations of explorers have searched the slopes of Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, where Genesis says the vessel came to rest. Satellite images have revealed what some researchers believe are the outlines of a large, ship-shaped structure beneath the ice. Other traditions point to different mountains: Mount Judi in Kurdish tradition, Mount Pir Omar Gudrun, the mountains of northern India. The honest answer is that we do not know. What we can say is that across multiple cultures, across multiple languages, across thousands of years, human beings preserved and transmitted the belief that one person, in one vessel, did something extraordinary, and that the world as we know it owes its existence to that act. The end. What it was like to die in the flood. There are no survivors' testimonies from the flood, only the stories of those who inherited the stories of those who survived. And yet, if you read the ancient accounts carefully, not for the theological content, but for the raw sensory detail, something else emerges, something that feels less like mythology and more like the desperate attempt of traumatized people to put language to an experience that no language had ever been designed to describe. The waters came from below and above simultaneously. That detail is in Genesis and echoed in Mesopotamian accounts. The fountains of the great deep burst open. This is not a description of rain. This is a description of geological rupture, of ground fracturing, of water surging up from aquifers under pressure, of coastal inundation from multiple directions at once. Researchers studying the mechanics of impact-triggered tsunamis have noted that the combination of ground displacement, ocean surge, and atmospheric flooding can create exactly this effect. Water appearing to come from everywhere at once, with no clear direction of escape. Imagine being on a hillside, watching the valley below fill. The water does not rise slowly. It rushes. The noise is unlike anything you have ever heard. Not rain, not a river, not a storm. Something deeper. Something that enters the body before the mind can process it. And the people in the valley, your neighbors, your family, your entire world, disappear under it. Not one at a time, all at once. In minutes. Archaeological evidence of catastrophic, sudden inundation is not hard to find. At the site of Tel Abu Harara, in Syria, one of the world's earliest farming communities, researchers found a layer of destruction dating to approximately 10,900 BCE, containing high concentrations of the same cosmic impact markers associated with the Younger Dryas event. The settlement was not gradually abandoned. It was hit. At Katalyok in Turkey, one of the most extensively studied Neolithic communities in the world, evidence suggests a sudden violent end to at least one occupation phase. All over the Near East, layers of sterile alluvial silt, deposited by flooding, interrupt archaeological sequences at dates that correspond to our period of interest. What the sediment record captures is the before and after. Below the silt artifacts, bones, hearth, remains, the evidence of human life. Above the silt, nothing. Or sometimes, new people, different pottery, different burial customs, different everything. The silt is a wall in time. On one side, A world on the other side. Its replacement. The people who lived below that line died, most of them, in a very short period of time. Their cities are gone. Their languages are gone. Their names are gone. They exist only as the faint echo of memory, preserved in the flood stories told by those who came after, the stories their survivors carried up from the water, clutching to the knowledge that they had once existed, and that the world had once been different. The restart. How humanity rebuilt. Something strange happened immediately after the flood period ended. Civilization appeared. Not gradually, as one would expect from a species rebuilding from scratch after a catastrophe. It appeared fully formed. Irrigation, writing, astronomy, metallurgy, legal codes, priestly hierarchies. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, independently, within a remarkably compressed time frame, complex societies with sophisticated institutions emerged as if from nowhere. Conventional archaeology's answer is that this development was gradual, and we simply don't have the earlier evidence. That is a reasonable position. But it sits uncomfortably alongside the traditions of every one of these cultures, which insists with remarkable consistency that their civilization was given to them, handed down, transmitted. The Sumerians said their knowledge came from the Apkallu, the fishermen who emerged from the sea in the period after the flood. The Egyptians attributed their sacred knowledge to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, astronomy, and mathematics, who received it from an earlier age and preserved it through the cataclysm. The Mesoamerican traditions speak of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, arriving after a great destruction and teaching the survivors how to build civilization again. Who were these teachers? The rational interpretation is that they were the survivors of the pre-flood civilization itself, people who had preserved knowledge in some form and were now dispersing it to the scattered remnants of humanity. Graham Hancock, whose work has pushed this idea into mainstream conversation, describes them as a civilizing minority, small groups of extraordinarily knowledgeable survivors who traveled the world in the post-flood period, appearing in different cultures under different names, teaching astronomy, sacred geometry, agriculture, and spiritual practice. Whether or not one accepts the full scope of Hancock's thesis, the cross-cultural pattern he identifies is real and demands explanation. Consider the common threads. In virtually every post-flood founding tradition, the transmitters of knowledge are associated with the sea, with the stars, with precise numerical and calendrical knowledge, and with a solemn obligation to preserve something. They come, they teach, and they leave, or they are absorbed. What they leave behind, encoded in temples and texts and calendrical systems, is a message to the future. We were here before you. Something terrible happened, and here is what we managed to save. The great mystery of ancient monument sites. The precision, the astronomical alignment, the inexplicable scale, may be explained not by alien intervention or lost technology in the science fiction sense, but by the simple fact that the people who built them were working from preserved knowledge, from blueprints and understanding that stretch back to a civilization far older than our histories acknowledge. They were not inventing, they were remembering. Imperfectly, as memory always is, but with enough fidelity to build things that still stand 10,000 years later. The human species did not rebuild from zero. It rebuilt from a fragment. A library in one head, or a handful of heads, or a few carefully preserved texts. And from that fragment, against all odds, it grew back into something that could ask questions about where it came from, what we lost forever, and what remains. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a name. It's the grief for things you never had, things that existed before your time, things that were extraordinary and are now simply gone. Not lost in a fire you witnessed, not stolen from you in a moment you remember, just absent. A hole in the historical record, shaped exactly like something that should be there and isn't. That grief, if you let yourself feel it, is what looking at the pre-flood world honestly will give you. Languages were lost. Not just a few civilizations worth. Linguists estimate that language families exist, which have left no surviving descendants, no recognizable traces in any modern tongue. They were spoken by people who had names, who told stories, who had words for things we no longer have words for, because the things themselves are gone. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Sumerian tablets, in Egyptian pyramid shafts, in the alignment of megalithic structures worldwide, most of it was not understood by the people who inherited it. They preserved it because they were told to. They did not always know what it meant. Like a child carrying a letter she cannot read to someone who will understand it. Generation after generation passed down fragments of a knowledge system whose full architecture had been destroyed. What the myths preserved, they preserved in code. The Great Flood traditions are not primitive superstition. They are compressed data, encoded in the language of story, because that is the only format robust enough to survive 10,000 years of oral transmission. Political upheaval, religious revision, and cultural transformation. The specific details, the 40 days, the 7 days, the birds, the rainbow, the olive branch, are not decorative. They are mnemonic anchors, markers in the code. The people who constructed these stories knew that the literal historical record would not survive. So they wrapped the data in narrative and hoped that the narrative, at least, would be remembered. Some of what was lost was not knowledge, but capacity. The capacity to build what they built. The capacity to live as long as they lived. The capacity to perceive the world the way they perceived it, with a cosmological integration. A sense of belonging to something larger, that our fragmented modern consciousness struggles to even imagine, let alone recapture. The Vedic texts don't describe the antediluvian age as a time of superior technology. They describe it as a time of superior consciousness. The technology was a byproduct. And then there is the question that the 12th topic was always building toward. The one that the entire structure of this story was assembled to ask, because every civilization that rose before the flood fell. Every one. Whatever they built, whatever they knew, whatever warnings the seers and prophets and astronomers among them delivered, it was not enough. They did not listen, or they could not act, or they acted too late. And the water came. Now we have inherited their world and their fate. We have their fragments and their warnings. We have their myths, which are not myths. We have their monuments, which we cannot explain. We have their silence, which speaks louder than anything they could have said. Are we different? Are we listening? The pre-flood world did not end because people were stupid. It ended because they were human. They were distracted and divided, and convinced that what had always existed would always continue to exist. The sky had always been there. The land had always been there. The next generation would figure it out if things got bad enough. And then the fountains of the deep burst open. What remains is this, us, and the stories. And the stones that are too heavy to move and too precise to explain. And the quiet, insistent possibility that somewhere beneath the ocean, or beneath the desert sand, or buried under 10,000 years of sediment, the rest of the story is still waiting, patient, preserved, ready to be found by whoever has the courage and the humility to look. The world before the flood was real. The people in it were real. What happened to them was real. And if we are paying attention, if we are truly paying attention, then what happened to them is the most important story we have ever inherited.